I just want to welcome everybody, those who were here last time around, those who are new to it today. For those of you who were here last time, we'll cover a few things by way of introduction that you may have heard last time, but just so we bring everybody up to speed, I want to take a look at a couple things that we did cover last time around. My goal in this is just to really offer a bit of a art appreciation, Christian art appreciation program here. Oftentimes we see things, I mean, for those of you who attend churches, you may see things on the altar or in the windows or whatever, and maybe not know where it connects to and things like that. And one of the things that I'd like to do here is just look at some of those connections from where we are here in Iowa in the United States back to Europe and back in time to the Middle Ages and even beyond. One of the things that interests me the most about this topic, iconography, that is, the writing with images, is the ability for these things to take us back in time to look at our connections with people who came before us. I was introduced to this subject at St. Louis University in a survey class on art and architecture back in the 1970s, and it spurred an interest for me. I'm not, by way of disclaimer, I'm not an art historian. I am not a theologian, but these things have been of interest to me all along. We'll be talking today about the four creatures. This came up in our last session that folks asked about it, and I want to make sure that we cover it and talk about the symbolism connected with the Tetramorph, or four creatures. We'll be looking at the Great Mirror, the Speculum Majus, some legendary creatures, the elephant as a symbol, the ass or donkey as a symbol, and this is not meant to be political in any way. I had some photos of these things from various trips, and I've been wanting to learn more about what they symbolize and how they came to be part of the architecture and art in some Christian churches and cathedrals. And then finally, we'll close out with the deer. Our sources for this will be the Bible, a book called the Physiologus, written anonymously in the 3rd or 4th century, which draws on a lot of Roman and Greek notions about nature and animals, some of it based on scientific observation and some of it just based on legend, and a lot of that creeped into books that came later. Another book that we'll be looking at is something called A Consolation of Philosophy. More on that later. It was written around around 500. Bestiaries, or books of the beasts, these are oftentimes based on the Physiologus. They came later, but a lot of the authors use the Physiologus as their source. And then another book called The Great Mirror. And I want to make the point that a lot of what we'll see in sculpture and stained glass really draws on the ideas that the authors of these books presented. The books and the images in some of the books really had an influence on art. And here now, just some things to know, some key terms. Iconography, I'll use this along the way, means basically writing with images. It comes from two Greek words, icon and graphos, meaning image and writing. And in one sense, it's a language that artists used images to convey ideas and basically write things in images. Some of the stained glass windows that we'll see are almost like cartoons. You can read them from left to right, bottom to top, and they tell a story. Analogy, a lot of what the medieval theologians did was write and speak by analogy, or they were trying to communicate by analogy, meaning a connection. They were looking for connections between, for instance, nature and their beliefs, nature and morals and ideas and teachings. And then finally, the tetramorph, which I've mentioned already, means four shapes. Tetra is Greek word for four, morph for shape. So that's where that comes from. And we'll start with the Tetramorph and talk a little bit about its origins. My wife, oh, okay, Merce's bringing me some water in case I need it. She's hearing some raspy in my voice. Thank you. The Tetramorph has its origins in the Hebrew Bible. Christians call it the Old Testament. And the book of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel wrote around the year 500 BCE, before our Common Era, before Christ, somewhere between 500 and 600. And he was writing at the time of the Israelites' Babylonian captivity, and refers in his book to being alongside the river Chebar, Chebar, where he had visions. And one of the visions was of heavenly creatures that included a man, a lion, an eagle, and a bull. And these creatures all had wings, and they were brilliant and so forth. And associated with each of the creatures was a wheel. And you'll see there in this image from Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and an entire window devoted to the book of Ezekiel, the four wheels of different colors here associated with the beasts or creatures. Now, these creatures, some scholars believe, are connected with the Babylonian Zodiac. Ezekiel, during this captivity, was in Babylon, or in or near Babylon, as he wrote this. And the theory goes that those four creatures represent the months of the year that represent seasonal transition. So you would have March for spring and so forth. I'm not sure which one applies to each month, but those are the 4 months dealing with spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Now, those four creatures then began to show up in the Middle Ages in various forms. And this is one of the most, I think, beautiful ones, where you have a book cover, probably a book cover for a missal used in the Mass with instructions for the priest and so forth. This one with gold inlay and enamel from France around 1200 has the four creatures up here. I hope you can see my cursor. With the man, the winged man, looking a little bit like an angel, but there's the man. Here's the eagle. Here is the lion, I believe, and here's the bull. And this is an image called Christ in Glory. You see around Christ this almond-shaped figure. It's called a Mandola, and it's basically the intersection of two circles. Think of a Venn diagram representing Christ's two natures, according to Christian belief that he's both God and human, and he's there at the intersection of those two natures. This imagery is drawn from the book of Revelation, St. John's Revelation or Apocalypse, with the reference to the Alpha and the Omega, that God is at the beginning and the end. Really at the beginning and end of time in this, God at the center of things. And there's another little connection to the Zodiac, the Babylonian Zodiac, with God being at the center of time. This imagery shows up in a bunch of ways. This is a gospel book cover from Germany around the 1200s. And we're going to take a look at each of those little images. This is silver and silk involved in this, along with ivory inlays here. There's a crystal with an image of Christ beneath it. And each of these now has come to represent one of the Gospels, and we'll talk a little bit about how that happened in a bit. But here you have the left, Matthew and his man, John and his eagle, Mark and the lion, and Luke and the bull over here. So where did this symbolism come from? It came, at least in part, it may have pre-existed this, but we know for sure that a monk who was contemporary with Charlemagne around the year 800 wrote a commentary on the book of Ezekiel that other monks and theologians and pastors used. And that commentary on the book of Ezekiel was written for its connection to Christianity and for what it might have taught Christians. And Rabanus Maurus, this monk from Germany, later became a bishop, had three interpretations of these creatures written up in his commentary on Ezekiel. And the first one, and the most familiar one to us, is that they represent the four gospel writers in the four gospels. That Matthew's man is connected with the man is connected with Matthew's gospel because it includes Jesus's table of ancestors at the very beginning. So the human connection going back. Mark's lion, that gospel has a line about a voice crying in the wilderness, and Rabanus Maurus connected that with a lion growl or whatever in the wilderness. The bull connected with Luke's gospel is because it opens up the gospel that starts out with Zechariah's sacrifice, and the bull is a symbol of sacrifice. And then John's eagle, because that gospel transports readers to the heart of divinity. So this is Rabanus Maurus's interpretation and how it became connected very closely as the Middle Ages went on with the four gospels. So now we're going to shift our view to some of the art associated with this. In France, at Chartres Cathedral, one of my very favorites, where I had the good fortune to meet Paul Schultz, who's on this call today, and his parents. Paul's dad was there for a presentation of the French Legion of Honor medal for his role and his commanding officer's role in helping to save this cathedral from shelling during World War II. So at any rate, we're going to take a look at this little spot down at the very bottom of the cathedral and some of the sculpture there. Here's where we see one of the most famous representations of the Tetramorph with Christ at the center of the four. I think I've got, let's see, here's a close-up of it. And you get to see Christ again in that Mandola, kind of hearkening back to the gospel cover. And then the man, the eagle, the lion, and the bull over here all winged. The four also appear on stained glass within that cathedral. Here's the rose window in the south transepts. We're going to hone in on that and show you where the four creatures appear in stained glass. Pretty much following the same pattern with the man, winged man here, the eagle, the lion, and the bull. That pattern, by the way, is a pretty common one that predates even Chartres Cathedral and its famous image of the Tetramorph. Now, given this association with Christ in majesty, Rabanus Maurus also interpreted the four creatures this way, that the four are actually symbols for Christ himself, that they recall four great mysteries from Christ's life, that the man represents Christ's incarnation by the Virgin Mary coming into human form, that the bull represents Christ's passion and sacrifice in the last week of his life, that Mark's lion, and we talked a little bit about this in the first presentation, that it represents the resurrection because the lion, according to the ancients, was thought to breathe on its young, on its cubs, after they appeared to be dead, and then on the third day the lion would breathe on them, bringing them to life. So there was that connection with the resurrection. And then finally, John's eagle represents Christ's ascension into heaven. Here are a few more images of it, and I want to point something out about this one. It comes from another cathedral in France, Auxerre Cathedral, which was damaged during the wars of religion in the 16th century. And one of the things you'll see here on the right, is certainly this image, this familiar image by now. But note on the bottom, you'll see a lighter blue color. This part of the window was broken out by the Huguenots when they occupied Auxerre during that turbulent time. It was restored later, and you can see here that the images of the lion and bull down below look a little more modern than the ones up above. The window's been heavily restored. A lot of it was restored in the 1900s. Some it was cleaned in the 1900s and restored in the 1800s. But the windows themselves and the different styles you might see in some of them in some churches actually convey some of the history that transpired between the 1200s and our times today. And now the connection. We wanted to connect some of these things to where we are in the United States and life in modern America. This is a church in New York City, St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue, not too far from St. Patrick's Cathedral, that was built in the 1920s. And facing Fifth Avenue is this rose window where you can see the arrows there, the four symbols of the gospel writers. Now, not conforming to the medieval pattern, but at any rate, they're all there looking down on Fifth Avenue. Here's a close-up of them. And shifting a little bit to the south, this is a rose window at Washington National Cathedral in DC. It's in the south transept again, very similar in placement to the one we saw at Chartres Cathedral, and a little bit different in its composition. But you see again the four figures, now again in pattern, surrounding the Christ from the Apocalypse, from the book of Revelation, with the Lamb, the mystic Lamb, the apocalyptic Lamb, and Christ in glory. Now, even closer to home, and this is one of my favorite churches in my hometown, Milwaukee. Over here you see St. Joseph's Basilica. It's a Catholic church, and a rose window with the four creatures around it here. Lion, bull, man, and eagle. St. Joseph's Basilica, if you get a chance to visit Milwaukee, is well worth it for a couple of reasons. The stained glass is great. It was designed by an Austrian studio. One little thing about stained glass in the United States, particularly in Catholic churches, a lot of it was made by German or Austrian studios, particularly from Munich and Innsbruck. And it was the manufacturers, the designers were kind of given a papal, not concession, but something similar to a concession. They were given an endorsement for the Catholic churches that were being built in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So a lot of it, with the exception of right around World War I, a lot of the stained glass in these churches, including some here in Iowa, come from these studios. And this one comes from Innsbruck. So lovely stuff. And this church is also interesting because it was built by Polish immigrants who had the good fortune, or at least the good sense, to buy much of what you see here, the stone and the portico, the classical portico here, from a post office that was being demolished in Chicago. So they carted it all up on trains to Milwaukee, and horses pulled a lot of the stone and stuff up to a site from the railroad tracks, and they rebuilt here. So one of the more interesting little pieces in our vicinity. Okay, and we'll end here with, in this section on the Tetramorph, with another interpretation. And this is one, again, from Rabanus Morris's commentary on Ezekiel, that these four creatures also symbolize the Christian way of life, and four requirements for salvation. Matthew's man represents this, that a Christian walks the path of reason. Man is a reasonable animal, and thus the Christian reasons that about his or her particular place in the grand scheme of things, sees God as at the top of the heap, and humanity's place in correlation to that. Luke's bull represents a Christian's practice of self-sacrifice, renouncing worldly pleasures. The lion, that Christians are bold. Trust God, fear not. And a line from the Bible, the righteous are bold like a lion. And then finally, John's eagle represents or symbolizes a Christian's contemplation of eternal truths, with a gaze like the eagle's turned upward to God. Now, that's a lot about the Tetramorph, and there's a lot more written about it, and we've just touched on a few of the things. I want to mention one thing in particular. You see this a lot, these symbols around us on altars and stained glass and so forth in the United States. Is probably the most common, one of the most common ancient symbols that we see and have adopted in art on this side of the Atlantic. Now I want to shift to another book, and that one is The Great Mirror, written by a monk, Vincent of Beauvais, in the 1200s. He and others were great compilers of knowledge, and Vincent wrote this huge compendium of knowledge called A Great Mirror. The idea that the nature, history, doctrine, morals, all of this represented or reflected truths that had been part of, that all of these things, history is a reflection of, it reflects and holds Christian truths. So it's this idea of correspondence between past and present and so forth. All right, and I should also mention that Vincent was not the first to write something called a mirror. There were dozens of mirrors written even before Vincent wrote his big one in the 1200s. This is a very popular book. A lot of monasteries had it or had parts of it. And The Mirror of Nature, from which we take our talk today, is one of those books. And what I'd like to do next is just show how these four mirrors show up in cathedral art. This one, over on the top left, represents the mirror of nature, and we talked about this image in our last one. It's the pelican and her self-sacrificing to keep her chicks alive. Here on the right, top right, is an image from the mirror of history, and folks in the Middle Ages looked at the Bible, and particularly Genesis and much of the Old Testament, as their history, pointing toward or with truths for their time. And this one shows God creating the heavens with moon and stars up above. This one, the mirror of instruction, shows two of the liberal arts with music here, one of the liberal arts on the left playing the bells, and grammar over here, reading from a book and teaching kids and having a little something here to whack the kids to keep them awake. You see one falling asleep here as he's trying to learn. This one is from Chartres Cathedral. This one with creation is from Auxerre. In France, the pelican is from Canterbury Cathedral. And the last one here, the Book of Morals, shows pride coming before a fall. It's a horse rider going at great speed, tripping and falling. So a little bit of something there about that horseman's lack of attention or arrogance or whatever it might be, but it's the pride comes before a fall image. Now, one of the cathedrals in France, I'm not quite sure about the the exact pronunciation. The name comes from a Celtic tribe that was there called the Senones. At Sens Cathedral, these mirrors show up in the portals on the front, the west facade of this cathedral, and we're going to take a look at some of that and how it shows up. Just another note here about how to read cathedrals and what shows up on them. This image from that left doorway shows up on the top register, two of the liberal arts. The one on the right is astronomy. She's holding an instrument called an astrolabe that during the Middle Ages was used to sight stars and help tell time. The folks in Europe inherited that or brought it from the Arabs through Spain. It came up probably in the around the year 1000 as a transmission between the Arab Muslims and the Christian scholars working together in Spain. We're not sure what this one is on the left, but it is likely another one of the liberal arts. Now, these are defaced. They were defaced during the French Revolution. It's one of the things that's really kind of hard to see when one visits France, that a lot of the sculpture and things were damaged during these turbulent times. So, mirror of instruction up above, and then down below, mirror of nature. You have here on the right an ostrich. Here on the left, we believe it's a camel with some riders on it. Now, elsewhere here, you'll see grammar, teaching the kids, and probably some philosophers over here again with that theme of mirror of instruction. Down below, not sure what these are. There seems to be, I'm sorry, go back, a bird, wrong way. A bird in the middle, could be a phoenix, could be something else. I'm not sure what that is. And over here, somebody riding some animal. At any rate, hard to tell what they are now. They've been weathered and damaged. But nearby is a very interesting pair of panels. One with an elephant with this structure on top. They call this image the Elephant and Castle. And over here, a humanoid figure with a foot over its head. Now, what's going on here? Well, here's a closer look at the humanoid figure. It's called a Sciopode, and it's a legendary figure that the ancients believed lived in India. And I'm going to mention one thing here before I get into talking a little bit more about the Sciopode. This comes from an exhibit at the Getty Museum, one of the notes on a placard there, and I thought it was really helpful. The bestiary's descriptions may strike the modern reader as fantastical. That's an understatement. But in the Middle Ages, animals were understood as divine creations that inherently reflected the teachings of Christianity. And so did some of the other legendary creatures. Unicorns, for instance, phoenix, all had Christian connotations, at least in the interpretations. But what the heck was a Sciopode doing there? Well, a Sciopode was thought to be a human-like creature who had just one leg. And the Sciopode shows up in various bestiaries. And big question for the people in the Middle Ages was, if we ever encounter one of these creatures that we've heard about from Pliny the Elder, Roman author, and the Greeks, what do we do? Do we point them to Christ or not? So you have that kind of question going on in this image from one of the bestiaries, one of the books. This Sciopode was thought to be a creature who could hop around on that one leg very quickly. And one of the authors wrote, the Sciopodes are in the habit of lying on their backs during the extreme heat and protect themselves from the sun by the shade of their feet. So that's what you see going on here, and that's what you saw on the image in the cathedral. But why this on a cathedral? One of the theories is that like the unicorn or the dragon, whatever, some of these other things that show up on cathedrals, these mythical beings are presented as evidence of the wonder and diversity of God's creation. So this is all part of really an homage to what they understood to be the amazing things, or some of the amazement of creation itself. All right, let's move on to another one. All right, here, Barcelona's medieval cathedral. Not the one by Gaudi, the one that's very famous there at Barcelona, but the older one from the 1200s. Ignore the pigeon. This is an elephant gargoyle. You can tell it's a gargoyle by its trough. It was a part of the drainage system for the cathedral itself, just draining water from the roof. This has been restored too. This part, the castle, where you would find soldiers in some paintings and things, and we'll see that in a bit, looks like it was restored. So too are the tusks and the trunk. But what would happen here is the water would come out through the elephant's trunk. The elephant, too, has Christian symbolism, which came as a big surprise for me. Here you see the elephant in one of the bestiaries with those soldiers up on top. This would have been familiar to people in medieval Europe, mainly from their the connections with Hannibal and the use of war elephants in Roman times, and the wars between the Romans and the Carthaginians. So they were drawing a lot on old history and old imagery to come up with some of these things in their books. But the big thing here about the elephant was the elephant's cry. And again, something that was not necessarily scientific, but a legendary understanding about the elephant. And it pretty much goes like this. They believe that the elephant didn't have knees that it would bend down with to sleep, that it just couldn't lay down and sleep at night, that it had to stand for just about everything. And unfortunately, when that elephant fell over, was knocked over by one thing or another, it needed help getting up. So here, according to the physiologists, is what would happen. The elephant cries out, and immediately there comes a great elephant who is unable to lift the first. Then they both cry out, and 12 other elephants arrive, and not even they, all 12, can lift the one who has fallen. Then again, they all cry out, and suddenly, thank goodness, a tiny elephant appears who puts his trunk under the great one and lifts him up. How does this become, this belief about how elephants get up after they've fallen, how does this become a Christian symbol? Well, here you go. The analogy to Christ is that the Christ, who is the wholly intelligible elephant, according to the physiologus, although he is greater than all the rest, he was made small in comparison to them. And here, drawing on the Bible, for he humbled himself and became obedient unto death in order to raise up man. So a biblical stretch here to an old belief about how elephants got up when they couldn't get up under their own power. There you see an elephant with his trunk as a trumpet. Again, they didn't necessarily have a whole lot of direct experience to draw upon. This is just another way that they represented the elephant in one of the bestiaries. And connecting to the United States, I can't say that I've seen a lot of elephants on churches in the US, but here's one at the National Cathedral, another gargoyle. It should probably come as no surprise to you that this gargoyle is in the nation's capital, and that elsewhere, although I don't have a photo of it, elsewhere on the cathedral is an image of a donkey. So there's a bipartisan approach there, at least on the National Cathedral's exterior. Okay, moving on now to the lowly ass. The ass or donkey is probably one of the most contradictory symbols in Christian iconography. On the one hand, you see here an image of Mary and Jesus with Joseph leading the way on the flight to Egypt. Mary and baby Jesus riding a donkey. This is from Chartres Cathedral and one of its famous stained glass windows there. You will also see images of Jesus riding a donkey or ass into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, an image of triumph. And at any rate, so the donkey, the ass, has these connotations with Christ as a Christ symbol, but also, as we'll see, some other connotations that are very much part of our language. But let's take a look at how this imagery of the donkey is developed over time. Here at Canterbury Cathedral is an image of Balaam riding his donkey. This is taken from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and a story that comes out of the book of Numbers. Balaam is a seer, a diviner, who lives in Palestine before the Israelites arrive, in Moab at least. They're on their way. They're on their way from Egypt into the Holy Land. And the Moabites' king asks for Balaam's help in kind of turning back the Israelites. He'd like them to curse them. Well, Balaam is a believer in God and refuses at first. And then the king puts a little more pressure on him and he refuses again. And the king then bribes him. And Balaam is quite torn by all of this. But in the end, Balaam goes along with the king's men and rides a donkey to do it. On the way, the donkey stops. And Balaam, not knowing what's going on, starts beating the donkey. Well, then Balaam takes the donkey in another direction, and the donkey stops again, won't go. Balaam beats him a second time. Donkey heads off in another direction, can't go any further, stops, sits down, lays down, won't go any further. Balaam beats him a third time, and finally the donkey starts to speak, much to Balaam's surprise. And the donkey says, "Why are you beating me? I've been a good donkey. I've taken you wherever you wanted to go. There's an angel stopping our way. I can't go any further." And finally, the angel appears to Balaam, and the angel tells Balaam that God is not pleased with him for going along with these Moabite princes, and he better fess up. So Balaam repents, apologizes to the donkey, and goes on his merry way. or at least back to where he started out. The story goes on. It doesn't end well for Balaam in the end, but a lot of conflicting things there about Balaam in that book, in the book of Numbers. But the donkey winds up being the hero in this, and one who sees divinity, who can see a divine messenger when Balaam couldn't. Why? How does that happen? Well, it's an interesting little story here. Here's a national cathedral with Balaam beating the ass. And I'm just going to stop here for a bit. One of the things about the donkey is that it has connections way back to probably Babylonian and Egyptian notions about the donkey's divine associations. So the Hebrews, in writing this story and incorporating this story into the Bible, may have been drawing on associations of the donkey as a god. There were people in the ancient Middle East who worshiped the donkey as a god, who actually had ceremonies wearing the donkey's head, or masks of a donkey. And there were rituals involving the donkey. So there were associations of the donkey or ass with divinity. And in this story in the book of Numbers, there may be some of that playing out, that something divine in the donkey was recognizing the divine in the angel when Balaam, a human, couldn't do it. So a divine association with the donkey, something that most of us, when we think about the way we use ass in the English language, may not occur to us at first. I mean, there are many pejorative connotations with ass in English right now, particularly in the United States, and that goes against this image of the donkey in Balaam's story. Now, there's another association with the donkey, and this goes back to Chartres Cathedral. It was one of the things that I couldn't figure out at first, but getting ready for this presentation enabled me to kind of sort this one out. It goes to a book called The Consolation of Philosophy, written by Boethius. And Boethius wrote, as the Roman Empire was disintegrating, he was a Roman who worked for one of the Germanic kings that ruled in Rome around the year 500, 600, right around there, as the Ostrogoths conquered Rome and made this transition from classical Rome to medieval times. But anyhow, Boethius was sort of a bridge figure between those two eras. And he shows up on the left in one of the doorways at Chartres Cathedral as a key philosopher. And Boethius, in this book, Consolation of Philosophy, was probably one of the most influential writings of that entire time. Almost all of the monasteries and churches had a copy of this book because it raised most of the issues about the nature of God and God's connection with humanity that they were wrestling with at the time as they struggled to move from classical philosophy into Christian belief and philosophy that came along the way. Among the things that Boethius wrote about in this book, The Consolation of Philosophy, was God's relationship and God's foreknowledge of things in that relationship to human free will. How did the two of those things jibe? The place of love, the place of fortune, all of that in written here, as Boethius has a conversation with philosophy, his imaging of philosophy, as he is imprisoned and will eventually die convicted of treason to that new king. But at any rate, in his book, he makes a reference, philosophy, as he's having a conversation. He's moping around, feeling badly about being imprisoned and why things aren't going well for him. And philosophy says to him a lot of wonderful things about, the importance of love in life, the importance of virtue. These are the things that we hold on to. And he's still moping, and she says, "Have my words penetrated your mind, or are you like the proverbial ass, deaf to the lyre or the harp?" Well, that image shows up on Chartres Cathedral. And it was referred to in the 13th century as Boethius's ass. You can't see the strings of the lyre, but they're over here. And here's the ass playing the lyre. And I want to just mention here briefly that this imagery dates back, or it goes all the way back to about 3000 BCE, 3000 years before Christ, before the book of Numbers and all of that, to an image that appears in excavations at Ur of the Chaldees, the place where Abraham got started. There's a harp, a sculpted harp on a tomb that was found in the 1920s. And on that sculpted harp appears this image of a donkey playing a harp. The sound box is a bull. A jackal is playing some other instrument, and a bear is dancing. So this image and the proverb that's associated with it go way, way back, farther back than I knew. At any rate, this image then shows up on other churches, not just here at Chartres, but in other churches in France in particular, where it became, that is, the ass became a symbol of ignorance, obstinacy, and in this case, really a figure of the absurd, an ass wanting to play the lyre or the harp. So this proverb dates back to one of Aesop's fables, just to keep the connection going here, in which an ass walking around in a field comes upon a harp and strums it, can't make heads or tails out of the sound, says he wishes somebody else who knew what they were doing could be there. And it just reinforces this medieval notion of the donkey or ass as a bit of a fool. Well, you see it there on Chartres Cathedral on the left, and some interesting little figures below. Why might they be there? Well, the interpretations continue. There's a book called A Mirror of Fools, in which Brunel, the ass, decides that it needs a longer tail. And Brunel goes off in search of a longer tail, wanting to look more like a horse. Along the way, Brunel also aspires to be some things he could never be, like here you see a bishop. It's a bishop's mitre over his head. He would like to be a scholar, so he goes off to Paris and he studies for 8 years, and after 8 years he can't remember the name of the town where he went to school. And all of that led to another proverb that the French came up with. It pretty much goes like this. Let's see, I'm going to take a look for that. If you send a stupid ass to Paris, where there was a university, if it's an ass there, it will not be a horse there. So this association with ignorance and the donkey or ass really developed in the Middle Ages and came out of this consolation of philosophy and the pejorative reference to the ass playing a harp, a lyre. We'll close up with the deer. And this one has a lot of meanings, so I'll start with the main one and then go quickly because we're running out of time. The deer in early Christianity was a symbol for the soul. And this comes from a verse in the Psalms. It goes pretty much this way. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. It's a modern translation. This panel is at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. And in its original form, it would have shown these two deer drinking from a stream that flows from the cross. And you can see part of the cross here. It was broken up and then just brought together at the museum. But it has connections with drinking from the chalice in Holy Communion, and other references that, again, connect the soul with the flowing waters from Christ. Now, in the bestiaries, there's a little story about the stag or the deer as a Christ symbol. And it goes pretty much like this. They believed that the deer was an enemy of the snake. So it says the stag is the enemy of the serpent. And to escape the deer, the snake hides in the crevice of a rock. But that wily deer can fill up his mouth with water and then spits it out into the crack where the reptile is hiding. So the snake is pretty much damned, it's caught between a rock and a hard place, so to speak. If it comes out, it's torn to pieces. If it stays hidden, it drowns from all of that water that the deer is spitting at it. And here's the analogy to Christ. Again, a bit of a stretch, but this is how they did it. In the same way, our Lord put to death the demon, the great dragon, both by the celestial waters flowing from his divine wisdom and by his ineffable virtue. The invisible serpent, that is the devil, cannot resist waters of this nature, but perishes at once. The deer, and here I'll finish quickly, is also shown up as attributes for two saints. This is Saint Eustace. This photo is from a stained glass window at Chartres Cathedral. The saint was originally called Placidus, and after his conversion, by an encounter with a deer that had a cross between its antlers while he was out hunting in the woods, Placidus became Eustace, which means, I think his name means something like fruitful, words to that effect, a Christian virtue. He also shows up in the iconography of Saint Hubert of Liège. And this one's probably a little bit more familiar. This is Hubert the Hunter and his deer with the cross in between his antlers at National Cathedral in DC. And just a note about Hubert and his stag, the one that helped him with his conversion. During the vision, at least so the legend goes, the deer kind of lectured Hubert on what it meant to be an ethical hunter. And in France and Germany, some of their hunting clubs still refer to these instructions from Hubert's deer. One of them, for instance, was that the hunter ought to make a clean and quick kill and could only shoot when that was possible. Only shoot old stags who are past their prime, and to euthanize a sick animal if he came across one, and not to shoot does who were with their young. So at any rate, it has some connection with hunting season coming up right now. The last deer, different saint, different attributes. Saint Giles or Saint Gilles came from France originally, and the legend with him is that he had a pet deer who fed him. He was a hermit, and the deer, basically, Giles drank from a little bit like Romulus and Remus. The deer fed him. It was a female deer through her milk. Giles eventually became the patron saint of Edinburgh, and that's one of the reasons why he shows up here at All Saints Cathedral and one of the windows at All Saints Cathedral in Milwaukee. Now, I will encourage you to be on the lookout for a whole lot of other weird creatures and They include the phoenix. This one's from Atlanta. An owl and lion combined. This one from Bath Abbey in England. And over here on the right, one of my favorites, the Bonacon, another legendary creature who unfortunately had horns that turned inward, so he couldn't use them to defend himself. So what did the creature do? Again, without a whole lot of scientific evidence, but certainly a great deal of imagination. The folks in the Middle Ages believed that this Bonacon creature had farts that were darts. Literally, that from the beast's backside, you had to protect yourself, and that's why they're holding a shield here against the darts coming from the Bonacon's hind end. Find them. They're out there. They're fun to explore and read about. And let's say thank you for attending. Here's some contact info for those of you who want it.